Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. Jesus then also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. He said, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now the Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even raise his eyes to the heavens and was beating his breast and saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. This is the second time in a couple months now that we've heard a parable from Luke's gospel that ends with this turn of phrase, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And just like last time, I'm again feeling that this parable really probably isn't about being more humble as a means of eventually getting more exalted. I'm not sure it's exactly that formulaic for us. Part of this parable, though, is pretty clear of a condemnation, it seems, of those who look down their noses at others. The Pharisees saying, thank God I'm not like those people, which is easy enough to understand. I think we know how that kind of thinking destroys relationships and strips dignity from people. It's pretty apparent. But no, I think this parable is about more than a simple moral tale because of primarily where it resides in Luke's gospel. I mean, in Luke chapter 18, where we are now, this is a point in which tensions are higher than ever between Jesus and the powerful religious leaders in his community, Pharisees among them, who are increasingly set against him. And a simple moral ethic, such as for those who exalt themselves will be humbled and those who humble themselves will be exalted, isn't really enough to warrant the kind of anger that we're seeing that they're expressing towards Jesus this late in the story. Nice morality tales don't often get people killed, and yet Jesus is closer than ever to being killed because of the message he's bringing of who he is and what he's teaching and who is following him because of it. This is why I think there's something else going on here in the parables today. Part of which has to do, I think, with our understanding of the context in which the people were living at this time. Now, the Roman authority in the region was pretty powerful. And one of the things that Rome demanded were taxes. And these taxes were levied through the tax collectors, like the character we have in the parable. And tax collectors, you might know, would go around and, surprise, surprise, they'd collect people's taxes. But what they'd do often is they'd add a little on top so that they could get paid what they thought they were owed, and nobody really liked these guys. Right? They were looked down upon in society. They were thought of as greedy, swindlers. They were out to get a buck at the cost of other people. But the thing is, These tax collectors and the people whom they were collecting taxes from, none of them were really living all that high on the hog. In the region at this time, subsistence living was common. Most people were barely getting by, but you couldn't not pay your taxes to Rome, because if you didn't pay your Roman taxes, you were considered an enemy of Rome, and, Roman enemies were killed and conquered. That's how the Pax Romana, Roman peace, that's how that worked. But the other thing on top of this is that the Roman taxes weren't the only benevolence required of the people in that Jewish community that Jesus was a part of. If you were an observant follower of the Jewish faith, you'd come to the temple at least once a year and make your offering, you'd give your tithe, and you'd be in right relationship with God and the community. But the thing is, with Rome taking most of the coin first, there weren't as many resources to go around for the common folk to give that temple offering. And so the pressure was on. The priests and the religious leaders, the priestly caste, they weren't landowners. They relied on what came into the temple to meet their needs. And so in order for them to maintain their status and their quality of life, they had to figure out a way to make sure that people would pay their temple dues on top of the Roman tax. And so the rule became that if you didn't pay at the temple, you weren't right with God. Are you beginning to understand maybe why Jesus is putting these two side by side? Pharisee and tax collector. I think he's trying to reveal something here, trying to show us maybe that these two who might be thought of as polar opposites are actually both kind of tax collectors in their own right. They're both gaming the system, so to speak, but the deeper issue is that the Pharisee is convinced that it's okay. And the tax collector is the one who recognizes his complicity in the exploitation of the people. And so I think Jesus is using this illustration to help illuminate for us the fact that what we think about ourselves and our community matters, because what we think about it affects the way we act about it. And the barrier then that these Pharisees have erected in their minds, pitting their superiority against others, has led them now to willingly ignore the injustices of their way of life, which is an incredibly risky thing for Jesus to be calling out in this context, which might be why he's approaching crucifixion. But it's risky for the sake of justice. It's risky for the sake of those who need a new way. Many of you probably know that I didn't grow up in Minnesota. I grew up in central Ohio, in the Columbus area, in a suburban community. And as is the case in many suburban areas, our neighborhood had previously been farmland before it was developed into homes and parks and businesses and such. And in our neck of the woods, the family that owned the land before it became the city of Upper Arlington, where I grew up in 1917, that family that owned the property was the Miller family. And as it turns out, we ended up living just up the street on Wyandotte Road from one of the members of that very same Miller family who had sold their farm so many years ago. Her name was Esther, and she, about my grandmother's age, was delightful. Her home was packed with books. We didn't always get in the house, but you could see, peering in through the windows, just stacks of magazines and books, and she'd always have a story to accompany the books that she thought my brother and I would find interesting. She was kind of our local historian, if you will, and I loved that. And yet, as much as so many things had changed there that she had witnessed through her lifetime over this past century, one of the things in that community that has stayed the same is the old stone fence that marks the old border of the west and north sides of the Miller Farm property. If you want to see what that fence looks like, the image on the front of the bulletin today is a very similar kind of construction. Limestone from the quarry nearby, broken into pieces, set up between the plots of land. And that fence there still stands today. I mean, it's been repaired a little bit over the years. And actually, it borders a golf course now, right there in the middle of our community. But part of what I love about this fence there is the way it represents the different ways people have thought about our human boundaries over the last century. I mean, we as humans have long separated ourselves from one another by various means, just as we see in the gospel story today. But what I love about this particular stone fence that still stands there is that it isn't a huge wall. It's not a blockade. It's not a fortress mount with a castle behind it. You can actually see right over it. It's, 3 or 4 feet high. You can even step over it easily in many places. It simply marks a boundary. And no matter what kind of ideology has been attached to this boundary over the years, and there are a few different thoughts to that, its good-natured construction has endured as a reminder of and testimony to, I think, our human interconnectedness beyond borders. That, there might be a line here, but we are together in this endeavor. Which has got me wondering today. What might we have to learn from these stories? What wisdom of our human interconnectedness might be given from these experiences or this parable today? What mystery is being uncovered before us in the work that this risky Jesus is calling us to? Might we be able to somehow recognize when our minds need to change so that our bodies and our actions and our systems around us might change as well? This is part of what I continue to appreciate about the way in which we are gathered in worship here every week, both in confession and with the antiphonal cry of Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. Because I think we do these things, these practices together, not as some pious act requesting the stay of divine wrath. I don't think that's what these are about. Instead, I think we continue to find meaning in these practices, confession and Kyrie, because they help us to recognize our part in what has gone wrong so that we might together understand God's call to us to be part of the mending and the healing and the movement towards justice. For this is what the way of Jesus is about. Making things right for the sake of those who have long been wronged. Indeed, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Lord of all nations, have mercy and grant us grace as we continue in this way, pursuing justice and life and peace. Amen.